What if the most important voice you'll hear all day speaks before the world even wakes? Soft, steady, and waiting in the quiet. What if God has been speaking every morning, not through noise, but through stillness, and we've been too rushed to notice? Before the phone lights up, before the world demands your attention, there's a whisper reaching for your soul. The question isn't, will God speak today? The question is, will you listen? The morning is unlike any other time of the day. It is not merely a beginning, but a threshold, a delicate line between what was and what is about to be. In the realm of spirit, thresholds carry weight. They are symbolic, meaningful, and often sacred. The morning possesses this quality. It is a moment untouched, a canvas not yet spoiled by the brushstrokes of obligation, distraction, or noise. The world has not yet fully awakened, and that silence, that hush which hovers in the air, offers something that is rarely spiritual openness. One might say the soul, in the morning, is most uncluttered. It has not yet taken on the burdens of thought, conflict, or responsibility, and so it becomes fertile ground, more ready to receive than at any other point in the day. This liminal space, this crossing point between night and day, carries with it the quality of invitation. There is an ancient pull here, something older than alarm clocks and schedules. It is the original call of the day, the whisper that life has begun again. Before humanity had machines and noise, there was sunrise. Before anything else stirred, there was light cutting through darkness. That very first act, daylight separating from night, has always been a divine rhythm. And embedded in that rhythm is God's voice, not as something new, but as something eternal returning. There's a curious gentleness to how the world awakes. Darkness recedes, not all at once, but in layers. The birds do not shout, they begin with subtle notes. The wind moves, but without violence. Even the sun does not blaze into the sky. It rises slowly, respectfully, as though the earth itself were in prayer. It is in these sacred minutes that God often speaks, not through spectacle, but through order, through the poetry of beginnings. The human soul, when quiet, can sense it, not as a command, but as a presence. The morning becomes more than just time, it becomes a temple. There is something profoundly human about our need for routine, yet mornings are not meant to be mechanized. They were not designed to be immediately filled with chatter, with screens, or with checklists. The soul, waking from the soft unconsciousness of sleep, is not ready for noise. It is still tender, still attuned to mystery. This is why the early hours have been cherished across cultures and centuries as sacred. Monks rise in the darkness to sing prayers. Prophets heard their callings in solitude. Even nature itself seems to whisper more clearly in the morning, as though the very air carries less static. To treat the morning as a threshold is to understand its purpose. It is a crossing over, a coming forth from rest into responsibility, from quiet into action, from dreams into reality. In this transition, we are offered a choice. Will we enter the day with hurried feet and distracted minds, or will we step with reverence, aware that something divine is present here? The world teaches us to rush, to hustle, to dominate time. But the morning refuses to be rushed. It is a gift that cannot be owned, only received. The sacredness of the morning is also tied to vulnerability. When you first awake, you are still unguarded. The defenses haven't yet risen, the masks haven't yet returned. You are closer to your truest self in those early moments than at any other time. That is why God speaks then. not because he prefers that hour in a mechanical sense, but because he longs to meet the real you, the one who hasn't yet put on roles or titles, the one who hasn't yet argued or postured or hidden, the one who is just a soul, fresh from sleep, reaching again toward light. It is easy to miss this threshold. In fact, most do. The day begins with urgency, alarms, demands, notifications, each one pulling attention away from stillness. Yet stillness is the doorway through which the voice of God is best heard. In the morning you are on the edge of something holy, and though it is fleeting, it returns every 24 hours, as faithful as grace. The sacredness of the threshold remains, not because of what we do, but because of who waits there. God, when he chooses to speak, does so with a voice that rarely demands attention. He does not crash into our mornings with noise and fury. Rather, he arrives with subtlety, a kind of gentle authority that does not impose but invites. It is a mistake to expect him to shout over our chaos, because he never competes with noise. He waits for silence. His voice is like the dew on grass, present but quiet, visible only to those who look carefully. It takes discipline to hear such a voice, not because it is weak, but because it is holy. The modern ear is trained for volume, not depth. We are surrounded by voices all day, notifications, conversations, media, the endless commentary of the world. These voices are loud, insistent, and often superficial. They aim not to reveal truth, but to capture attention. But God does not operate like this. His voice does not bend to the expectations of a distracted generation. It does not rise just because we are unwilling to lower our own noise. He speaks not with thunder but with whispers, not with spectacle but with stillness. This is why the morning holds such importance. In those first few moments, before the machinery of the world begins to hum, before our minds are flooded with thought and worry, there exists a quiet space. It is within that space that the whisper of God can be heard. But even then, it is not guaranteed. One must be attentive. One must come with the humility of a listener, rather than the ambition of a seeker who demands answers. God is not a broadcaster looking for an audience. He is a father waiting to be heard. To understand the nature of God's voice, one must first understand the nature of his character. He is not manipulative. He does not coerce or force belief. He allows the heart to choose. His voice reflects his nature, patient, kind, merciful. He does not invade the soul, he knocks. He does not dominate the will, he beckons. He is the shepherd who calls his sheep by name, not the tyrant who drives them with fear. And this calling is most clear when the world has not yet begun its clamor. But the difficulty lies in our attention. We often measure God's presence by emotional impact. We expect to feel a surge, a sign, a moment of unmistakable force. Yet, his presence is often marked by what is not there: fear, confusion, anxiety. His voice brings clarity without noise, conviction without shame, and peace without explanation. But to notice these things requires a soul trained in stillness. One must learn the language of quiet, which the world has long forgotten. The challenge, then, is not that God does not speak. The challenge is that we do not listen. We fill our mornings with noise almost reflexively. We reach for phones, for updates, for music, for movement. We act as though stillness is a danger to be avoided. But God speaks in the stillness. He speaks in the space between breaths. He speaks when the heart is quiet enough to hear something beyond itself. Not because he is hiding, but because the things he says are too sacred to be shouted. Some would argue that if God wanted to speak, He would do so unmistakably. But that misses the point of relationship. The God who formed the stars does not need to prove himself through volume. He seeks not just to be heard, but to be known. And to be known, one must come close. One must sit in the quiet and wait, not for magic, but for presence. It is this waiting that refines the soul. It teaches patience, attentiveness, surrender. In this process, the heart is trained to recognize the subtle shifts of divine communication. The promptings, the impressions, the scripture that suddenly feels alive. When one finally hears the voice of God in the morning, it is often not a sentence but a stillness that speaks. It may be a verse remembered, a thought illuminated, a fear suddenly eased. There is no formula, no guarantee of how or when, but there is a promise: those who seek him early will find him, not because he plays hide and seek, but because he rewards hunger. The whisper of God is a gift, and it is given not to the loud or the restless, but to those who come early and listen long. Listening to God is not an act of spiritual sophistication, it is an act of surrender. Many approach the idea of hearing from God as though it were a skill to be mastered, a formula to be followed, a puzzle to be solved. But God is not a system, and his voice is not caught by human cleverness. He is not silent because he is distant, but because he wants the heart quiet, not the mind busy. The posture required to hear him is not one of control, but of relinquishment. To listen well is to admit we are not the center of the story, that we do not already know the way, and that our agendas must bow to a higher will. In the morning, before the gears of the day begin to turn, there lies an opportunity, a moment to yield, and it is precisely here that the soul is met with a crossroads. Either it will rush into the day's demands, determined to master time, or it will kneel, even in spirit, and say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." This posture is not natural to the human heart, which prefers activity over waiting, explanation over mystery, and control over trust. Yet God speaks most clearly when the soul has stopped trying to steer the conversation. This is the battle that takes place in the first moments of the day. It is not fought with swords or shouted prayers, but with the quiet wrestling between our need to lead and his call to follow. We often wake with plans already forming, thoughts racing toward outcomes we desire. We begin to architect the day in our minds before we have even offered it to the one who owns time itself. To truly listen to God in the morning requires an inner undoing, a conscious choice to set aside urgency, to silence our own voice long enough to hear his. But this surrender is not passive. It is active waiting, intentional humility. It is not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of attentiveness. A surrendered heart does not come to God with a list of demands or expectations. It comes to be shaped, to be corrected, to be held in the tension of divine silence if necessary. Listening becomes a form of trust. It is not the pursuit of spiritual experience but of communion. To wait in this way is to acknowledge that God's timing, his method, even his silence, are all wiser than our loudest prayers. There is a profound difference between spiritual ambition and spiritual surrender. Ambition seeks answers, clarity, results. Surrender seeks presence, relationship, alignment. One says, "Tell me what to do." The other says, "Make me who you want me to be." Listening without surrender is merely spiritual eavesdropping. It attempts to use God as a means to our own ends. But listening with surrender opens the heart to transformation. It is no longer about what we hear, but what hearing does to us. how it bends the will, softens the pride, awakens the soul to God's nearness. This is why the morning matters so deeply. It is not just about time, it is about attention. The morning offers us a fresh space to reorient ourselves, not to information, but to relationship. And in this quiet, the soul is given a choice to strive or to surrender. Striving may produce movement, but surrender produces meaning. Striving may get things done, but surrender makes us ready to be guided. In the kingdom of God, readiness is not marked by strategy but by humility. Many will say, "But I do not know how to surrender." And that itself is a kind of beginning. To admit helplessness before God is already to be on the path of wisdom. Surrender begins not with great gestures, but with small confessions. It begins when we say, "I cannot direct myself," and continues when we say, "I trust you will." In this way, listening becomes a kind of worship. Not music, not movement, but holy stillness. A kind of waiting that holds the soul open like empty hands, prepared to receive whatever God chooses to give. Listening, then, is not something you do with your ears, but with your life. It is a way of being in God's presence that says, "Your will, not mine." It is the decision, renewed each day, to stop building a tower of self-wisdom and instead sit at the feet of the one whose voice spoke galaxies into being. In the morning, when the heart is most vulnerable and the day is still unshaped, this decision becomes the most important one we make. Not because it changes God, but because it finally allows Him to change us. Each morning, long before our alarms sound or our minds stir into the familiar cycle of thoughts, the world outside is already bearing witness to something ancient and holy. Creation itself begins its day in worship. The birds do not wait for human company to begin their songs. The trees lift their branches as if in silent praise. The sky slowly transitions from darkness to light in a quiet revelation of beauty and order. All of it, from the rising sun to the rhythm of the wind, is not random, not mechanical, but purposeful. Creation testifies. It does not speak in words, but it declares nonetheless. And the message is consistent, persistent, and rooted in truth. God is near, God is faithful, and every morning is a quiet resurrection. Nature does not have to be taught how to respond to God. It responds simply by being what it was created to be. A flower opens not because it has calculated the weather, but because it was made to bloom when the sun rises. The stars disappear not because they were told to hide, but because their time to shine has ended, and now the sun must take its place. All things in creation know their rhythm, and they obey. This obedience is worship. This worship is testimony. And this testimony is speaking every morning, often unheard by the ones it was given to. The human soul. There is something deeply humbling about watching the world awaken. It does not ask permission. It does not wait for audience approval. It simply begins. And in this beginning is the quiet voice of God, inviting those who would listen to join in the sacred rhythm of life. The sun does not rise just to give us light. It rises to remind us that light always follows darkness, that no night is forever, and that the Maker has set all things in order, even when we feel our own lives are falling apart. The Psalms often speak of the heavens declaring the glory of God, of the firmament showing His handiwork. These are not poetic exaggerations. They are spiritual truths clothed in the language of the earth. Every sunrise is a divine proclamation that God has not abandoned His creation, that the covenant still holds, and that mercy is new, not recycled, not repeated, but new with each dawn. The morning is a sign that no matter what yesterday held, today is filled with newness. Not because we deserve it, but because God is always beginning again. The birds do not worry about food before they sing. They do not pause to check if the sky is safe. They sing because it is morning. They sing because they were made to do so. And in that singing, there is a lesson. That worship is the right response to waking up. That before we reach for answers, for coffee, for headlines, the soul should reach in gratitude, in acknowledgement, in recognition of the grace that allowed breath to fill our lungs once more. The creatures of the earth are often more attuned to the voice of God than those made in His image, not because they are more intelligent, but because they are more obedient. To watch the sunrise is to witness a miracle that has become too familiar. It is to see the earth rotate, light overcome shadow, and the world be born again. Yet familiarity often breeds forgetfulness. We forget that it is not just light. It is a symbol, not just beauty, but truth. The morning testifies of a God who does not slumber, who brings order out of chaos, who renews what we thought was spent. Creation becomes a silent preacher, offering a sermon without words, calling us not just to believe in God's power, but to rest in His consistency. In the quiet of morning, when the fog still rests over fields and the streets are not yet filled with traffic, there is an invisible chorus rising, not from concert halls, not from churches, but from the world itself. It is a chorus of trees swaying, of dew forming, of light stretching across the horizon. It does not need applause. It does not seek attention, but it is real and it is holy, and in that holiness God speaks. Not with commandments or warnings, but with beauty, rhythm, and renewal. It is not that He waits for us to listen to nature. It is that He has always been speaking through it. Every morning, creation gives its sermon. Whether or not we hear, it is up to the posture of our soul. There is a profound influence in what the soul hears first. The first voice that enters the mind upon waking holds an extraordinary power over the rest of the day. It is like the conductor's baton at the beginning of a symphony. It sets the rhythm, defines the mood, and influences the harmony or dissonance that follows. The human mind, so vulnerable in its early moments, becomes shaped by the first sounds it allows to speak. If that voice is rooted in fear, anxiety will soon become the lens through which everything is seen. If it is rooted in distraction, then clarity and purpose are clouded before the day even begins. But if the first voice heard is God's, if it is His truth, His peace, His presence, then the heart is aligned, and the soul becomes anchored amidst whatever storms may come. In the stillness of the morning, the soul stands open, uncluttered, unguarded. The defenses haven't yet risen, the business hasn't yet begun. It is in that openness that influence takes root. Whether we are aware of it or not, the first influence always shapes our thoughts, emotions, and intentions. This is why God's invitation to meet Him early is not about obligation, it is about formation. He does not demand the morning because He needs it, but because we do. When we allow His voice to be the first, we allow His truth to become the lens through which we see everything else. The first voice can become either a compass or a storm. It can either direct us with quiet certainty or sweep us away with confusion. Consider how quickly the heart is unsettled by even the smallest provocations. An email, a headline, a worry about what lies ahead. These things, if given permission to speak first, will often speak the loudest. Their echo becomes persistent, and soon They drown out the deeper, quieter truths. It is not that God stops speaking later in the day. It is that our ears become too crowded to hear. Listening to God first is not about a mystical experience, nor is it necessarily about hearing a literal voice. Sometimes it is as simple as letting Scripture speak before the screen does, as quiet as a remembered promise before the rush of tasks. It may be a prayer whispered while the world is still asleep, a word of gratitude before the pressure of performance begins to press. It may be sitting in silence, letting the stillness remind us that we are not the source of our own peace. Whatever form it takes, the principle remains: the first voice teaches the heart how to hear everything that follows. When God speaks first, everything else falls into its rightful place. That does not mean the challenges of the day disappear, but it means they are seen through the right perspective. Worries do not vanish, but they lose their power. Duties do not shrink, but they no longer define our worth. The soul that has been anchored in the Word is not easily swayed by the winds of criticism, comparison, or fear. The heart that has been reminded of its identity as beloved is not easily manipulated by the noise of insecurity. The tragedy of modern life is not that we lack time to hear God. It is that we fill our first moments with lesser voices. We reach for devices instead of devotion. We welcome headlines before holiness. We absorb noise before truth. And then we wonder why we are restless, why peace seems always slightly out of reach, why the day feels like a battle before it has even properly begun. The answer is not more productivity or better strategy. It is better listening. And listening begins with choosing which voice gets the honor of being first. There is a sacredness to beginnings. The way something begins often shapes how it unfolds. This is true of music, of story, of relationship, and it is certainly true of the soul. To begin with God is to begin rightly. Not because every detail of the day will then be perfect, but because the heart will be prepared. The soul will have received its compass. It will have been reminded of who is in control, of what really matters, and of the unseen kingdom that is more real than anything seen. To listen to God first is not just wise. It is protective. It guards the heart against lies. It shields the mind from fear. It positions the soul not to react, but to respond with clarity. And in a world that constantly seeks to shape our thoughts before we are even fully awake, choosing to let God speak first is one of the most powerful and countercultural decisions we can make. When the invitation of God to meet with Him in the morning is ignored, something subtle but significant begins to take shape. It is not always noticeable in the early hours, but as the day unfolds, the absence of that divine encounter becomes clearer. The soul begins to feel untethered, as though navigating without a map. The demands of life start to press in, not with the weight of purpose, but with the weight of confusion. We move, but we move without direction. We work, but without peace. The heart begins to carry burdens it was never meant to carry alone, all because the first and most vital meeting of the day was missed. There is a deceptive confidence that often comes with business. When the calendar is full and tasks are checked off, it is easy to believe we are succeeding. But success without divine alignment is simply movement in the wrong direction. When God is not the one who speaks first, we begin to build our days on the strength of our own understanding. We become guided by mood, by urgency, by circumstance. Decisions are made from the pressure of the moment rather than the wisdom of the eternal. It is not that we cease to believe in God, but that we operate as though we are sufficient without His guidance. This independence may feel empowering at first. There is a sense of control that comes when we set our own pace and follow our own plan. But over time, the soul begins to fray. Anxiety creeps in. The noise of the world grows louder. The heart becomes reactive, rather than anchored. And all the while, God remains ready to speak, not with anger, but with longing. He is not waiting to reprimand, but to restore. Yet He will not force His way in. The gentle whisper is not heard over the roar of self-reliance. There is a kind of fatigue that enters the life of the one who walks without listening. It is not merely physical tiredness, but spiritual depletion. The soul was not designed to carry the weight of the day unaided. It was made for communion. It was made to be filled before it poured out. When that filling is neglected, the pouring becomes strained, shallow, and short-lived. Even good intentions wear thin without the strength that comes from abiding in the presence of God. To ignore Him in the morning is not just to miss out on comfort. It is to miss the very fuel the soul requires to endure. Every morning that passes without acknowledging God is a silent declaration of independence. We may not say it with words, but our actions confess it. I can do this on my own. And though He allows us to try, the outcome is always the same. A life lived apart from divine direction gradually drifts toward frustration, confusion, and emptiness. The strength we thought we had begins to crumble under the weight of unforeseen burdens. The clarity we believed we could maintain becomes clouded by 1,000 competing voices. But even in this wandering, God remains near. His voice is never withdrawn, only obscured by our inattention. He waits not with resentment, but with mercy. He calls to us not just once, but again and again. Each morning is another invitation to return, another chance to listen, another opportunity to start rightly. The grace of God is seen not only in His willingness to speak, but in His patience when we fail to hear. There is wisdom in prioritizing His voice before all others, not because He demands to be first out of pride, but because He knows what lies ahead. He sees the challenges before they reach us, the decisions before we face them, the needs before we feel them. To meet with Him in the morning is to receive more than comfort. It is to receive preparation. It is not simply about beginning the day with a religious habit, but about being shaped and equipped for everything the day may hold. When we choose to ignore that time, we choose to walk into the day without armor, without light, without direction. And while God may still move through our circumstances, we will have missed the clarity that could have spared us confusion, the peace that could have guarded our hearts, the wisdom that could have preserved our steps. Time is not the issue, posture is. It is not about how long we sit with Him, but about whether we've opened our hearts at all. The greatest loss in skipping that sacred moment is not God's silence, but our own unreadiness to hear. When we consider how God speaks in the morning, we are not simply reflecting on a moment of peace or a religious habit. We are uncovering the heart of a relationship. The morning is sacred not because of its silence alone, but because it is the hour most free from distraction, most open to awe, and most aligned with the rhythm of creation itself. God speaks not with force, but with gentleness. He does not interrupt, He invites. He speaks in whispers, in beauty, in stillness, and through the quiet sermons of nature. To hear Him, we must choose surrender over strategy, attention over activity, presence over performance. The first voice we allow into our soul becomes the voice that shapes all others. And when we neglect that divine encounter, we enter the day under our own weight, rather than His grace. But every morning is a fresh invitation, a door opening to light, direction, and peace. The question is not whether God is speaking, but whether we are willing to pause, listen, and begin the day not as masters of time, but as children eager to hear their Father's voice.